Illegal Chinese migrants are flooding the U.S. southern border. Is this part of some grand scheme? Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. If you haven't been paying much attention to American news, good for you! You must be so happy and well-adjusted. But you might not be aware that the U.S. southern border is being flooded by millions, not hundreds, not thousands, millions of illegal immigrants. There have been more than 1 million encounters since October, and a good chunk of these illegal immigrants are Chinese.
Just after sunrise, we saw the first group of migrants make their way from Mexico through a gap between the 30-foot steel border fence and rocks, ducking under a bit of razor wire and into the United States. 30 minutes later, a smuggler's SUV raced along the border fence and dropped another group at the same spot. Over 4 days, we witnessed nearly 600 migrants, adults and children, pass through this hole and onto U.S. soil unchecked.
Although the number of Chinese coming in isn't as large as the number of Venezuelans, Chinese migrants are the fastest growing group entering the U.S.
From 2013 to 2022, CBP recorded fewer than 16,000 Chinese migrants illegally crossing the U.S. southern border. This past year alone, more than 31,000. That's roughly double the prior 10 years combined.
So how are Chinese migrants making it to the U.S. border in record numbers? Why? TikTok, of course, as well as other apps like WeChat, WhatsApp, and Telegram, all of which contain step-by-step instructions if you know where to look. There's actually an entire economy built around getting Chinese migrants to the U.S. from places like Ecuador, which doesn't require a visa for Chinese nationals. So they fly to Ecuador, then from there travel all the way to the United States. Man, that's the worst routing I've ever heard of, at least since Taylor Swift's jet allegedly took a 28-mile flight. And yet I'm destroying the environment for wanting to use plastic straws. There's a reason why the number of illegal Chinese migrants has grown so much. China's economy is tanking, so it's no surprise that many are coming to the U.S. for economic opportunities. That plus the political liberties that come with it. And the U.S. is by far the most popular place for Chinese citizens to seek asylum. Currently, any applicant who shows they have a credible fear of persecution in their home country can pursue an asylum case, which is very attractive for illegal immigrants to the U.S. It's especially attractive as an alternative to getting visas, which are harder to come by these days. What's even more attractive for illegal Chinese immigrants is the fact that a majority of Chinese people get granted asylum, probably because it isn't too hard to imagine people being persecuted in China. All they would have to do is show the Border Patrol this channel, and hopefully tell them to subscribe. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, in 2023, 53% of Chinese migrants were granted asylum, and only 12% were denied. As comparison, just 5% of Cuban and Haitian asylum applications were granted during that time. Now, part of it is thanks to legislation that grants asylum for families fleeing China's one-child policy. Of course, people fleeing China also tend to have plausible arguments for their cases, given how authoritarian China is. Their argument could just be, China? Yep, well done getting out of there, you poor thing. But even among those rejected, illegal Chinese migrants don't have to fear being deported. That's because China doesn't accept Chinese deportations from the U.S. According to a former Assistant Secretary of State, they would just plain refuse to acknowledge the person was Chinese. They said, well, we don't know if they're Chinese. So for illegal Chinese migrants, just getting across the U.S. border is a win, asylum or no asylum. Given that U.S. Customs and Border Protection can't indefinitely detain migrants, Chinese migrants end up being released into the U.S. Now, this raises a lot of concerns. Chief among them fears that China's using the border crisis to send military-age men for its own nefarious purposes. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. The U.S. southern border has seen record numbers of illegal immigrants from China, including hundreds of military-age men. This has some worried that Chinese agents could be among them, including former President Donald Trump. He's worried, not he's a Chinese agent.
From China, there are 28,000 people in the last few months. 28,000, that's what's he doing, building an army? And they were mostly men, almost all men, from the age of 18 to 25. So what's that all about?
Primarily men between the ages of 18 to 25? I can't tell if they're building an army or describing the demographics of this channel. What up, fellas? At the very least, there's concern that the CCP has some hand in coordinating migrant infiltration.
Clearly, the Russians infiltrated people, migration, who set up homes in Ukraine, and then were saboteurs in the invasion. Now, I'm not saying that China is going to invade the United States, but if we were to defend Taiwan, I mean, you have to think that this is a part of some plan or strategy. You'd be foolish not to at least consider that.
I do not believe that the people I encountered had left China without the knowledge of their government. I believe their government has some reason to have facilitated.
In response, the New York Times calls these concerns immigration conspiracy theories. Yes, because if the CCP is known for anything, it's being absolutely cool with thousands of people fleeing and having no idea where they are. Meanwhile, PolitiFact calls them an unfounded scare tactic. In fact, PolitiFact dismisses the notion of a stealth invasion by China using immigrants as nonsense and fear-mongering. What makes it nonsense and fear-mongering? Well, PolitiFact claims that comments about Chinese military-age men infiltrating the border are misleading, pointing out how U.S. Customs and Border Protection doesn't release specific age or gender data about immigrants, and how military age means different things in different countries. Some places use child soldiers. And of course, I'm talking about Narnia. It really doesn't get brought up enough. PolitiFact does admit that most Chinese immigrants who reach the southern border are adults traveling alone and that there are a lot of men. However, it focuses on how illegal Chinese immigrants come into the U.S. in search of jobs and freedom. But surely, they couldn't possibly have anything else in mind, right? Heck, maybe the reason they're mostly men is because they're all huge fans of Joe Rogan. Forget jobs and freedom, they want DMT and MMA. PolitiFact says it found no evidence such as news reports, anecdotes, or government data showing that immigrants from China are coming to the U.S. at the direction of China's military. Now, I have some questions. Can't it be simultaneously true that Chinese migrants are trying to seek jobs and freedom in the U.S., and the CCP is trying to exploit the border crisis? I know, exploiting people, that doesn't sound like the CCP we all know and love. They usually give people who want to leave gift baskets with croissants and cucumber water. Also, who said anything about immigrants from China coming to the U.S. at the direction of China's military? It could be at the direction of the Chinese Communist Party or a Chinese organization with ties to the Chinese government, which is to say every Chinese organization, since they're required to have ties to the Chinese government. And further, if there was a plan by the Chinese government to send military-age men across the U.S. southern border, would it really be in public government data or news reports? We've seen that it is, in fact, in anecdotes. Just one example, according to Joseph Humeyer, the executive director of the Center for a Secure Free Society, and someone whom we've had on our podcast. There's evidence that China's exploiting the migrant crisis and is probably sending agents of some kind.
So China capitalizes on that weaponized migration strategy to be able to insert its own operatives. I've traveled to Panama, Colombia. I've traveled to a lot of these borders over the years, and more recently was told specifically by specific authorities in some of these countries about individuals that they have high suspicion belong to not the PLA per se, but Chinese intelligence services that are operating through the migrant routes. And so I think China, like the conditions for the mass migration was created by Venezuela, and then China capitalizes on that to insert its saboteurs into the network.
Which makes sense. If they're sending in people to essentially be spies, it's not like they're sending them with military records, government documents, and a t-shirt that says, "I'm sneaking in to destabilize America and all I got was this lousy t-shirt." China loves plausible deniability. So when it comes to illegal Chinese migration and security, I think the real question people should be asking is whether those coming into the U.S. are acting as agents for advancing the CCP's agendas. You best bet that the CCP would do whatever it takes to exploit whatever problems the U.S. has. Now, people will say that China can already send spies and saboteurs through legal immigration. But that shouldn't therefore mean that we should ignore the possibility of China sending agents into the U.S. illegally. It's a very real possibility, with or without Chinese military direction or involvement. Fortunately, the U.S. doesn't inspire much confidence in its ability to prevent that from happening. The U.S. border is so broken that U.S. officials recently watered down the vetting process for illegal Chinese immigrants. At this point, Waffle Houses are more selective about who they let in than the U.S. border. According to an April 2023 email, Border Patrol agents were told to radically reduce the number of interview questions for Chinese migrants apprehended from roughly 40 to just 5, having to do with military service, universities, region of birth, employment, and political party affiliation. Wow, that's it. Sounds pretty easy for illegal immigrants to just give the answers border agents want to hear. It's almost as if the U.S. is rushing to let in as many illegal immigrants as possible without scrutiny. I wonder how they determine if the illegal immigrants are lying. But lying aside, there are just so many immigrants that Chief Border Agent Anthony Good warned the Homeland Security Committee in a private hearing last September that the U.S. can't vet them all. This is so concerning that even Dr. Phil is sounding the alarm. You know something's wrong when Dr. Phil is panicking. The U.S.'s lack of vetting is basically an open invitation for Chinese agents. It's almost as if it's inviting China to do its own Area 51 raid on the U.S. southern border. And if you don't get that reference, it's because you don't spend much time online. To that I say, good for you. You must be so happy and well-adjusted. But with all this chaos going on, you could probably use a little stoicism in your life, which you can learn more about in the latest episode of my new show, Deep Thoughts While Gaming. Check it out and let me know what you think. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.